Hey, welcome everyone. This is Ashley from PreventConnect, and you're joining us for our web conference today titled Key Concepts, Models, and Frameworks within the Field of Sexual and Domestic Violence Prevention. PreventConnect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So we have some objectives for us today. Really, we're hoping to be able to describe some of those key concepts and models that are used a lot in the current field of sexual and domestic violence prevention, hoping to identify some resources that would be really helpful for folks who are new to prevention, and then also share resources and knowledge that would really support preventionists that are doing work in their organizations. So I asked this kind of like off the record, I guess, but I'm wondering for you all who haven't already responded, we'd really love to know just how long you've been working in the sexual and domestic violence prevention field. And Mo said since '07. Tori, how long have you been working in the violence prevention field?
Like 4 or 5 years at this point.
Okay, great. And how old am I when you think about this really quick? Let me do some math. I can't tell you a year, but I want to say like 15 years for me. And I started at local rape crisis centers in the prevention program as well. So I want to do two things right now. I want to officially introduce you all to Mo Lewis. Mo is the prevention specialist at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Mo, hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for letting me also be part of the profile pictures with pets. I did change mine up so you can see my dog. This is very rare. She's in my sweatshirt in this photo.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Mo. We're happy to have you and your cute puppy dog. So Mo, I'm looking at the text chat because we just asked, how long people have been working in violence prevention, and so there's such a range, like, we expected. So 5 years, 8 years, 6 months, since '98 on and off, 5 months, 3 months, 21 years, less than a year. Oh, someone else since '07, Mo. 2.5 years, 3 years, since 1979. 7 months, 3 years, since 1994. And then a year as an advocate, and then 6 months in just prevention. So there is quite a range, which is awesome. It's so cool to see people who have been doing this work for many, many years. And for those of you who are new and have a couple months, that's really exciting, and we're so happy that you're part of this. So, Mo, this is really the question, right? What can we do to prevent the problem from occurring in the first place? That's what we're here to talk about today.
We are going to talk a lot about it.
Yeah, because this is really the question that drives our prevention work. We know, there's a lot of really great reasons to focus on prevention, but I think that one thing that we know is that trauma causes more trauma, and also if we're really committed to equity and social justice, we really have to focus on prevention. So that's what we're here to discuss today is what do we do to prevent sexual violence, intimate partner violence in the first place? Why are we focusing on prevention? And so one thing that I wanted to point out, and this might resonate with a lot of you, maybe not, but a lot of work happens after sexual violence or intimate partner violence has already taken place. And so we can think of prevention as being on a continuum, right? And so after violence has already happened, there's a lot of work that takes place, right? There's we want to deal with the consequences of the violence that has happened in the short term, but then we also want to deal with it in the long term and create kind of lasting interventions. And so I think that, in my experience, a lot of the work that I was doing in a local agency was really happening in the thick and in the aftermath of violence that had already happened. Today, we really want to focus on the violence before it ever has a chance to take place, right? So we're looking at the continuum. We're really looking at upfront. What are approaches? What are strategies? What are frameworks for thinking about how we can prevent violence from that initial perpetration or victimization? And so that's where we're going to focus a lot of our conversation today. So Mo, I'm already going to ask our audience another question, and I'm really wondering for you all, where does your prevention work that you're currently doing fall on that continuum? So, and this is kind of a two-pronged question. So where does your work fall? Are you doing it before it's happened? Are you doing it in the thick of the violence? Are you doing the aftermath? And then what activities are you actually doing? And so, Mo, a lot of people, it looks like, are typing into the text chat. So we'll see what folks have to say about that. But right now, I'm going to keep moving on, and I'll come back and see what people are saying. So one of the really exciting things is that over the last 15 or so years, our understanding of the problem, and right now I'm going to specifically talk about sexual violence, but the same is true for intimate partner violence as well. We've learned so much more about prevention, about what actually works to prevent sexual violence. And so what you all see on your screen are two really important documents and resources from CDC. The first one, Sexual Violence Prevention, Beginning the Dialogue, was released back in 2004. And I know personally for me, this was right around the time when I started doing prevention work, and I had a copy of Beginning the Dialogue, and I probably read it like 20 times. I had so many sticky Post-it notes throughout it, and it really gave me the framework for talking about primary prevention. Mo, I'm not sure if you have a story about using Beginning the Dialogue, but for me it was such an important resource.
Oh yeah, I feel like it's the thing that I always go back to and refer other people to, and it really helped frame the work that I do and like the understanding of it too.
Absolutely. So the exciting part is, so Beginning the Dialogue, like I said, it was published in 2004, but just last year, late last year in 2019, CDC released Continuing the Dialogue. And so Continuing the Dialogue really does continue the dialogue that was started back in 2004. And what's really exciting is that it really highlights all the things that we've learned since then, since 2004. And so two of the pieces that I think are really relevant to this conversation is that Continuing the Dialogue focuses a lot on cross-cutting efforts. And what I mean by that is that violence is connected, and so different forms of violence share risk and protective factors. And so there's a lot of really great work around risk and protective factors and being able to prevent multiple forms of violence. The other thing that Continuing the Dialogue really highlights, and we're going to talk more about this later, but is this focus on community-level strategies to prevent violence. And so that is just where we've kind of been and where we've gone. So I wanted to highlight both of those. And Tori, if you would pop the links to those in the text chat, that would be great, because I do think our audience would benefit from those resources.
Yeah, I can do that again. I know folks are still replying a lot of all the great prevention work they're doing across the continuum.
Tori, why don't you share with us what some of the things that you've seen come up?
Sure. So, yeah, folks are all over the continuum, and it's so great. And thank you for all of you for responding and including the different activities that you're doing. So for folks who are up front and focusing on primary prevention, we have folks who are doing bystander intervention education like Green Dot. folks who are doing prevention and response in the thick of it. They're doing training for Cheryl, I'm going to assume DOD is Department of Defense personnel on bystander intervention. Feel free to correct me in the text chat if that's wrong. We have folks who are victim advocates who are working after the event, or who are full range victim advocates. We have folks who want to be doing more work up front and in primary prevention. Thank you for joining us today so you can learn more about that. Folks who maybe personally work in primary prevention, but their agency works across the continuum too. Folks have a heavy focus on consent awareness. Stephanie sharing about the community level strategies that you all are doing with community coalitions. That's awesome. Again, we have folks doing bystander intervention, folks who are doing curriculum for middle school and high school students. Yeah, there's so much happening with prevention and with folks working all across. A lot of it does seem to be school-based, community-based, really a lot of different prevention strategies. We're excited about it.
Cool. Thank you so much, Tori, and thank you all for sharing the work that you're doing. And yeah, there's a lot happening. I'm scrolling up right now. So I really love this quote, and a lot of you might be familiar with it, seen it already in your prevention work, but we're going to, as we move into some of the primary prevention tools and frameworks, this quote is something that I always kind of go back to. It really helps ground me in why some of the tools and frameworks are really, really important in prevention. And so Institute of Medicine says it is unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, cultural, and physical environment conspire against such change. And I think that we can, really apply this quote to not just sexual violence or intimate partner violence or violence in general, but any type of choice that people make. So I often think about this quote in terms of we know generally, probably, what we should be eating to feel our best. That doesn't mean that we always make those decisions, right? And so what are the things happening in our social, cultural, and physical environments that would lead us to make a different decision? And there's a lot of things. I think about on my way to work, I drive past billboards that show delicious fast food options, or I drive past the Starbucks, or I don't have time in the morning, so I have to make a different decision. So it becomes really important then that we don't just focus on giving people information and knowledge, right? Because we could be super, super knowledgeable about something, and it doesn't mean that we're going to change our behavior. And so we'll talk more about that as we go through some of the frameworks. But that is somewhere that I always like to really start. I also really like this definition of primary prevention from our friends at Prevention Institute. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Prevention Institute is an organization here in Northern California that works on prevention strategies across a range of public health issues. And so they identify primary prevention as a systematic process that promotes healthy environments and behaviors and reduces the likelihood of an incident, a condition, or an injury before it occurs in the first place. And so I really like that focus on promoting healthy environments, right? Again, we're getting away from just focusing on looking at individuals, but how do we actually create spaces and environments that really promote health and safety and equity. So those are just two little things that I wanted to bring up. But Mo, I know that you have a lot of really awesome information for some of these tools and frameworks. So I wanted to pass it over to you and see if you would walk us through these primary prevention tools and frameworks and what they mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm here to talk with you about these usual suspects of prevention. I say usual suspects because it reminds me of the movie, and it also makes me think of just the tools and the frameworks that that we tend to use a lot in this work. These are models and frameworks that are really at the base of a lot of work that we do in ending sexual and intimate partner violence. So if you're not familiar with these, you're in luck, because we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about each one. And then if you are familiar, then hang in there with me and with us. And also feel free to share any additional links or things that you find helpful in the text chat. So this is the homepage of an e-learning tool that I helped create at NSVRC. It's called the Primary Prevention Primer, and it goes through some of these basic tenets of primary prevention. You can see from the tabs at the top, it covers 4 different things. So it covers the moving upstream story, the social ecological model, which we'll be talking about in a minute. It also goes over the differences between risk reduction and primary prevention, and then at the end it has a quiz that can help you check your knowledge. We can put a link to this in the text chat, but the thing that I really like about this is that it's self-guided. It takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes to run through, and you can really just share it with anyone who needs primary prevention knowledge or even a refresher. So if it's like someone you work with, I've heard this works really well with people who are new employees or folks like maybe on your board of directors. Or even your parents. I had my parents pilot test this when we were putting it together, and I felt like, oh, you finally understand what I do for work. They were like, we get it. So I really encourage you to use this with anybody you want to. So yeah, there will be a link in the text chat so you can check it out if you're interested. And let's get into this. So has anybody heard of the moving upstream story before? I feel like this is definitely one of the usual suspects in our work. The longer I do this work, and I don't know if you have the same experience, Ashley and Tori, but the longer I do this work, the more versions of the story I end up hearing. So sometimes you might hear it called the river story or the upstream downstream story. And if you have a link to a version of the story that you really like, feel free to share it in the text chat. I'm always looking for like new ways of telling the story, but let me tell you really quick what the gist of it is. It's a story that is really used to illustrate what primary prevention is all about. And the way the story goes is that there is someone near a river, maybe they're working or having a picnic or hanging out, and they see someone in the water who's rushing down the river and not happy about it, they don't want to be there. So this person who's on the riverbank rescues the person from the river, and over time there's more and more people who are ending up in the water needing to be rescued. The rescue efforts get bigger and bigger, and then someone wonders, how are all these people ending up in the river in the first place? Like, what is happening? What's going on? We should go upstream and find out. And that is the basics of the story. It's more fleshed out than that, but the key components are usually the same. So in this field, we typically think of intervention and advocacy as the downstream response, so the folks helping people out of the river. And then we think of primary prevention as the upstream response, so figuring out like what's happening to cause people to get in the river in the first place, what are these root causes, so that we can hopefully fix some of those things, right, so that people are not finding themselves in the river when they don't want to be. One of the things I really like about this story is that I feel like it has a great way of showing that both intervention and prevention have a place in our field, and it really helps people also think about what moving upstream could look like. It's really visual and kind of gives you that story to think about it. This is a link, which we can also put in the text chat, of other versions of the moving upstream story. This is from PCAR, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. They're our sister organization, and they have some different versions that you can look at.
Thanks, Mo. And I just wanted to add for this part of the river story that this was one of the first times that I had seen it presented where the river story or the moving upstream story incorporated risk reduction and awareness. And I think that is so great for folks to see, you know, in addition to the risk reduction versus primary prevention section that you have in the primary prevention primer, I think this is also a really great visualization for folks to see, you know, what is the difference between primary prevention and risk reduction. So spoiler alert, in this one, the primary prevention activity in this part of the moving upstream story is someone is actually going and changing the physical built environment that fixes the bridge so folks aren't falling into the river as much. So that's changing the conditions that allow violence to occur, which is what we do in primary prevention, versus risk reduction in this part of the moving upstream story. Those activities are things like posting signs, handing out floaties and water wings to folks, teaching people how to swim. And so I feel like it's a really great way for folks to stop and think, like, okay, what is this prevention strategy doing? Are we changing the conditions, or are we giving tools for folks to adapt in a world where violence is occurring?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah, I encourage everybody to check this out. The blobs are very cute. I remember when we were putting this together, and we were like, what's the one with the blobs? The blobs. Oh, yes, this has the little blobs, so the cute blobs you can check out. Here is the public health model, which I feel like probably folks are familiar with. I know that if you go to school for public health, you learn about this sort of thing. And we wanted to show you this model because it's widely used in this field and other public health fields too. And you can see that the steps build on each other, and then they also double back on each other. And this is because as we do our prevention work, we'll focus on a few risk and protective factors. You know, we know the problem, focusing on those risk and protective factors. We'll try out some prevention strategies. Maybe they'll work, or maybe they don't work the way we were hoping, and then we try again. And this process of trying again is really normal, and I think it's worth thinking about because, you know, we're people doing this work with other people, and sometimes what works in one community isn't guaranteed to really work in a different community, and that's okay. I feel like this model can give us some framing for how we approach this goal of preventing sexual or intimate partner violence before it even has the chance to happen. And one other thing I'll say before we continue is that this idea of public health has existed for a long time in this country, and it's not always been the most awesome in actually creating widespread health. We'll go into that in more depth in just a bit, but I did want to say real quick that it's always really important to place ourselves and our work in this larger context, no matter what framework or tool that we're using. Okay, who knows about the 9 principles of effective prevention programs? I have to say, I'm trying to not look too much at the text chat because as someone who has always really relied on PreventConnect web conferences for like my own personal learning, the text chat is sometimes one of my favorite places to be because I feel like that's where people are always sharing their info and talking. So I'm not going to look at that, but what I want to do is talk to you just a little bit about what these 9 principles are. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. I will cover a few that are sometimes misunderstood. But I do want to say that I really like this model. I mean, I like all the models, but the way that I like to use this one is kind of like a personal checklist for how I'm doing. So a lot of times I'll use it like, okay, I'm going to check in with myself. Am I doing these things? Am I doing all of them? Are there any that I need to like put into place or spend more time on? So if there's a particular way that you really like to use these principles in your work, let us know in the text chat. I think it would be really interesting to hear from folks about how this is effective for you. So where do these come from? If you are not familiar about like the source of these 9 principles, the folks who came up with them were looking at prevention programs in 4 different areas. So they were looking at substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, school failure, and juvenile delinquency and violence. And what they wanted to do was see what kinds of things make up an effective prevention program. And these are 9 things that the programs that were successful tended to have in common. So let me talk about just a couple of them. One is theory-driven. I'm sure we've all heard that the work that we do should be theory-driven. This means that our strategy should have a scientific justification or logical rationale. And I think sometimes people think that that means that you could only use a prevention curriculum that's been like tested in a multi-year randomized controlled trial, but that's not the case. So first, in terms of theories, there's all these theories that we're talking about right now that can be used to help guide your work. And second, when we're talking about evidence, it doesn't necessarily mean always a big fancy research project. It also includes things like experiential evidence and contextual evidence, and we'll be talking more about those in just a little bit. So stay tuned for that. When we're thinking about programs being appropriately timed, this means that program activities should happen at a time developmentally that can have a maximal impact in a participant's life. So sometimes people think that this appropriate timing means like clock time or how long of a period do you have in a classroom or something. But really this idea of appropriately timed has to do more with making sure the strategies you're using and the topics you're discussing are appropriate for the age of the people you're working with. It's kind of like consent. If you're going to talk about consent with little kids, you would talk about it differently than you would if you were talking about it with like middle schoolers. And then if you were talking about consent with people who are college age, that conversation would be a lot different too. So comprehensive, right up here at the top, it means that your prevention strategies should include multiple types of activities, affect multiple settings, and go beyond awareness raising. And this is, I think, a great reminder to just always be mixing things up. So if your prevention program is in a school, you could see if there are other settings you could try, like if the same people who are in school really like to go to like a certain coffee shop after school, or if a lot of folks are in an after-school club or sports team. Those are some ways that you could make your prevention affect multiple settings. Let's see, there's one more that I'll cover. Unless folks have any questions, you can pop in after this and let me know. So one of the ones that I'll cover next is, this is the last one, is sufficient dosage. So the idea behind this is that participants in your prevention programming need to be exposed to enough of the activities for them to have an effect. So that means your prevention programming needs to happen over a long enough period of time so that the programming impacts participants' knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and skill acquisition. So I don't know if getting enough dosage is an issue that folks are having, but personally, I've been able to use this resource, these 9 principles, in the past to help me talk with supervisors about like why it's important to have many doses of a prevention program and maybe why I should be doing like a multi-session program instead of just going to places 1 or 2 times. So that's a way that it's personally helped me. Those are the ones that I was planning on covering, but if there are any questions, we can definitely talk more. Put them in the text chat. Maybe I'll pop over and look at it now. I'd love to hear how folks are using this.
Yeah, I don't see any questions yet, but Laura did just give you some kudos for saying what you said about theory-driven and not needing a big research-driven project necessarily to have evidence.
Oh, yeah. I think that's such a big one. And, you know, we'll talk about it more, but I heard something in a recent training, and Ashley, I think you were there too. There was someone talking about this idea of evidence and something being evidence-based, and they were like, look, it's evidence-based with the population that they were doing the research with. And I thought that was really interesting, and it kind of made me switch up how I think about evidence and, like, what is evidence-based, because we're not all working with the people who were the group that the research was being done with, right? So I know a lot of the curriculums that have this sort of like double-blind, researchy, multi-year sort of thing might be working with like high school age, white, upper middle class, in a suburb group of students. And if we're not working with that exact group, then it's not necessarily for sure that that program would work with another group, even if there is this sort of like robust evidence behind it. So that's another way that I like to think about or like kind of question the idea of evidence and what counts as evidence. So yeah.
I think so. I think too, I mean, it like having that evidence is really, really important. We do need that, but it also, we know it takes a lot of resources, and so, there's a lot of really important work that's happening that, folks might not have access to those resources, and that doesn't mean that the programs aren't, changing lives and changing communities. So thanks for that reminder.
I think it's so nice that we have all of these tools, because we can use these tools to help us shape the things that are going to work the best. And so I think that's the real gift of having all of these frameworks, is that we can look at all of them and figure out what makes the most sense and what the community that we're working with is really going to want.
Absolutely. So with that, I want to, before you go into talking about the social ecological model, I wanted to share another framework that I think a lot of people use in their prevention work. And this one comes from, again, from our friends at Prevention Institute, and it's known as the spectrum of prevention. And so I'd be interested in hearing if anyone is using the spectrum of prevention in your prevention planning and work. So you can let us know in the text chat. But basically, the spectrum of prevention is you can use it a couple different ways. But if you look at it, there's these different levels, right? So at the very top are strategies that would influence policy and legislation around prevention. There would be things about changing organizational practices. And so as you'll start to notice that we're kind of like funneling down as we go down the ladder, I guess. Fostering coalitions and networks is another level of the spectrum. And then we start to go a little bit more narrow into working at like the relationship level, so educating providers. So that could be things like, educating teachers, promoting community education. And then at the very bottom would be things like strengthening individual knowledge and skills. And so one thing about the spectrum of prevention that I want to mention is that what we know is that we can have a greater impact if we're not just putting all of our efforts in one of these groups, but if we're really engaged in work that cover these different categories. And so the thing is that there's this synergy. There's this real like momentum that gets built by working across these different areas and levels, rather than if we just spent all of our time and resources on strengthening individual knowledge and skills. We know that we'll be more successful and we'll build that synergy if then we also promote community education, if we also educate providers, if we foster coalitions and networks, change organizational practices, all the way up to the top, working around influencing policy and legislation. So that is another framework that I think has been really helpful, and I'm not sure if anyone is using the spectrum. Doesn't look like anyone responded. So I know that there are many people who are. We'll put a link to where you can learn more about that. But Mo, I'm going to pass it back over to you now.
Okay, great. I have to say, I have not always been the biggest fan of the spectrum of prevention, and I think it was because I was misunderstanding it, and I discovered a really nice way of thinking about it and using it. And it was when I worked at a local rape crisis center, and people were sometimes jealous of me getting to do prevention. And they were like, your job sounds so fun, and you get to do all of these like cool social justice things. And I was like, yeah, it is really great. We can talk more about like the differences between prevention and intervention and how people feel about it another time. But I was like, no, everybody in this place has a role to play with prevention. And we ended up using the spectrum of prevention as a way of like helping people understand how their work really does fit in with this range of prevention. And I found that to be really helpful, and I think other people really liked it too, because it's not like there's one thing or the other, or you can only do this thing or you can only do that thing. the spectrum really shows us that there's like all these different roles that are really important in doing prevention work and in creating change in communities and cultures. So I really like it for that purpose, and I don't know if that's useful for other folks to hear about, but that's how I've used it. Okay, let me find the slide of what we're talking about next. Ah, the social ecological model. This is our very good friend. I feel like this is one of the more well-known models out there. It's used in so many fields. And I also know that in some places, particularly like campus work, a lot of folks include a fifth level inside there. So like in between community and society, there would be another little egg nested in there for institutions. For our work, though, we tend to just use this one with 4 levels, and I'll go through these pretty quick. This is, you can see from the primary prevention primer. So when we're thinking about the individual level, at the very center, this is us. This is our own individual attitudes, our values, our beliefs, our behaviors. It's like us and how we move through the world and what we personally believe in, what motivates us. At the relationship level, this includes our relationships with others. So it's this kind of more dynamic, how do we interact with each other? And it includes not just romantic or sexual relationships, which I think sometimes when we say the word relationship, people can think of like, oh, this one kind of relationship. But it also includes relationships with friends or our peers, our peer group, neighbors, families, mentors, all of those kinds of things fit within that relationship level. When we're looking at the community level, we're really thinking about communities, just any sort of communities. It can be a community based on proximity, so like if you're in a neighborhood or a city. Communities can also be about affiliation. So if you're part of a certain faith community, a local organization, if you share certain demographics with people, you could be part of that community too, like part of the LGBT community. We'll get a little more detailed into like this level in particular in just a few minutes. And the society level here, this is like big S society. So it's the soup we're all swimming in. We all are just in it. Institutional norms are in here, our criminal legal system, mainstream media, things that in the world that, like in the society that we're like all walking through and existing in all the time that impact all of us. So when we are looking at the social ecological model, one of the things I like to note is that each of the levels interacts with the others. The other thing is that our work is really way more effective if we can work at more than one level. This leads us back into thinking about the community level, because I think generally in our field we're all really rocking at the individual and relationship level. That's where most of our prevention work in this field has been focused for, I would say, the past 10 or 15 years. We've really been focused on like what are ways we can change people's individual hearts and minds, what are ways that we can influence how people treat each other, how can we build skills with how to like ask for consent or respect someone's boundaries. And now lately there's this kind of renewed focus on that community level and really seeing if we can stretch our work to that level. And honestly, I don't know if you, Ashley and Tori, have been getting this too, but we at NSVRC have been getting a lot of training and technical assistance requests to help with this, because people are like, community level, this kind of freaks me out. What is this? How do we even do this? So we can talk about this a little more. This slide has what I think is probably one of the best ways to get at like what does community level mean and what the difference is between community specific prevention and community level prevention. And honestly, sometimes I feel like we're just saying the word community so much that it becomes one of those words that loses its meaning, and then it's just like a sound, like community, like what am I even saying? But I think that we end up hearing this word and like saying it so much because we all know how important communities are to doing any kind of good prevention work. Our work should always be community specific. This means that the kind of prevention we're doing will really look different based on who we're working with. And like I was saying before, like just because a program has this one kind of evidence that shows it works with one community doesn't mean that it'll work with another community. So that means we always need to make sure that it's fitting within the norms, experiences, interests, strengths, all of that within the community we're working with. What we're talking about when we talk about community level prevention, I have this litmus test that I like to personally use. If I ask, does this work impact and benefit the entire community regardless of whether they even know the prevention group exists? And I like asking this because you don't necessarily need to be a part of a prevention program in order to have that community level change benefit you. This community level is something that we can work to be stretching towards. I know that it can be intimidating to think about like how to do that, but we have an example. So I have an example page. Here we go.
Mo, you have a request to repeat the question you use as your litmus test.
Oh, thank you. Okay. The question I use is, it's kind of like right here. Where's my little drawer? Oh, I was going to do a little drawing, but I can't tell where to find it. So if you look under community level, my question is, does it impact the entire community regardless of whether they know the prevention group exists or the prevention efforts exist? Oh, you have it.
Let's see.
There's like all this behind the scenes webinar stuff that's happening. Oh, you're doing it. Here we go. So this is the question that I like to ask myself. We've been really thinking about, like, as people who do TA around this, as people who are like tasked with helping others understand this work and do this work and figure out like what exactly does this look like and mean. I think of community level stuff as like, we're walking within the community, we're in the community. If we think about back to the moving upstream story, like, is there this bridge? What is the community that we're part of? And what are the characteristics of the community that we could change? That, like, there might be a group that fixes that bridge and really helps the problem of people being in the river, but you don't necessarily need to know that there was a group that fixed the bridge. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the community has to like be a part of the group fixing the bridge. I don't know if that makes sense. You should let me know in the text chat. Let's talk about this program example because I think this might be a helpful way of thinking about it. This is a prevention program. It's just kind of like a generic example of what a prevention group could look like. I picked a high school group because I know that there are a lot of folks who are doing prevention in schools. In this example, we have a lot of things that we want to see from a prevention program. So you can see that there's positive relationships from staff and peers. There's students examining their own beliefs and values. And I think this relationship level example is pretty cool. It has students leading workshops for parents, which is kind of flipping the script on how we might expect something like this to go or who we might typically think about who could teach us things. At the community level, this example is that the students are working with staff and faculty to pass a student bill of rights. So if we think about the litmus test, does this pass? And I think it does. So a student bill of rights is something that will impact every student who's part of that school. It'll impact them even for years in the future after the students who like worked on passing that student bill of rights have already gone on to college or work or whatever they want to do. And they don't even have to be part of the prevention group. They don't even have to know the prevention group exists in order to benefit from this. And then you can see at the societal level, the group is working with their coalition around legislation. I like this example because it mirrors some legislation work that's happening in Washington State right now. But I do want to give a quick caveat that you'll want to check your funding before you embark on any sort of lobbying or legislative work. I know that for the RPE program, the Rape Prevention and Education funding, doing any lobbying with that money is prohibited. So that's just my quick reminder about that. And here is just a little bit more of what prevention could look like at each of those levels of the social ecological model. With the community level specifically, this could look like policies and procedures, things like dress codes, behavior standards. Sometimes sports teams have like those player codes of conduct, that sort of thing. And it can also include like training the people who are responsible for implementing or enforcing those policies. So maybe part of your prevention work is revising a policy or creating a policy, and then another part of your prevention work could be training people on like, what does this policy mean? How do we enforce it? How do we make sure that everybody knows it and is following it? And one of the things that we can share more resources about too, but it's not in here, are the ways that you can do this community level prevention by affecting the built environment of the place. So we've talked about it a little bit, but it's not built environment like, hey, let's put in more light bulbs so people can see each other and not sneak up on one another. The built environment stuff is more about impacting community level risk and protective factors that like increase or decrease a community's safety and cohesiveness. Now I want to look at the text chat and see what people are thinking about. Oh, it's a little slow. I see there is the repeat of the question, and Tori typed it in. Thank you so much for doing that.
Of course, happy to do that. So, Mo, this is such a great example, and I think folks are getting some clarity on the difference between community-specific and community level. So since you have this great example of a program across the social ecological model, we really want to know from folks what levels or level of the social ecological model are you already reaching, and what levels can you add? You had mentioned that our goal is to stretch out to the community level. All of our programs should already be community specific, but how can we stretch it out? And I really want to hear from folks. We all really want to hear from folks in the text chat about where are they currently and what levels do they want to stretch to. So I see some folks typing. We'll give them a little bit to respond to that. In the meantime, Ashley, do you want to talk to us about norms?
Sure. So we'll come back to your text chat responses. So please put those in there. I see some of you have already put some comments. So Mo, one of the pieces that you talked about at the society level was changing cultural norms. And so I thought that we could just take a moment to look at some of the norms, like some key norms, and then some of the norms changes that we've been able to see recently. So when we think about norms, and I'd love also for you all to be thinking about like what are some other norms that you're seeing show up in your communities and in the work that you're doing. But we know that norms are really kind of those things that they're all around us, right? They're really taken for granted as just like the way things are. But they have the power to really shape behavior, to tell us like what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate. They can often be based in cultural traditions, and so they're a big part of our work. So our friends at Prevention Institute have identified these kind of 5 key norms that allow violence to continue to exist in our society. And so what I want to do is point these out, but then I want to show some examples of how we're seeing some of those norms shift and change, and love to also hear your examples. But the 5 key norms are really a culture of violence. So violence just kind of like being part of our fabric, and not, we're kind of like desensitized to it. Another norm would be narrow definitions of masculinity, limited roles for women and girls, a real emphasis on power and control, and then privacy and silence around the issue of violence. So here we go. So here's an example of culture of violence and kind of the shift. And this isn't specifically tied to sexual or domestic violence, although we know that it's very connected. But I thought that this little cartoon comic really kind of showed where those shifts are, that we are having these conversations of calling out that it's become kind of normalized in our culture, and specifically this one is looking at mass shootings, but there's this shift that this is something that we've realized is not okay, and so and I'm curious to hear where you all are seeing shifts in this kind of culture of violence, and maybe it's from some of the conversations that have happened around the Me Too movement. So that's one example. Another example is around narrow definitions of masculinity. I feel like there's been a lot of new research and new resources and articles recently around what it means and what are kind of the outcomes of really adherence to narrow definitions of masculinity and how harmful that is for all genders, really. And so an example of the shift that I'm sure all of you saw or familiar with was the Gillette ad that I guess debuted last year. I guess it was in 2019, that really, kind of looked at what are these examples of toxic masculinity or narrow definitions of masculinity, and how can we shift that, and what does that shift look like? And we'll put a link to that in case the off chance that you haven't seen it. Another example, limited roles for women. I think that this is one of those things where you see a really great example of how that's shifting, and then you see an example of how it's not shifting. But there's women are definitely, this is a conversation that continues to happen, and this example is just, a little tiny shift of a really cool first African-American all-women flight crew that happened. So, women moving into roles that traditionally, they weren't seen as being able to occupy. An example of a shift around this idea of power and control, there's a lot of organizing and work out of Black Women's Blueprint around the documentary Surviving R. Kelly. And so this idea, and R. Kelly is just one example. There's many examples of people who have used their power, and not just them, but also the people around them have really helped uphold that. Harvey Weinstein is another example. But there's been these shifts where we're actually hearing the voices of survivors and people are listening. So that is an example of that one. And then finally, around privacy and silence, I think one of the big shifts that we've seen in that norm was really Me Too. And the leadership of Tarana Burke and so many women having these conversations, so many people having these conversations about, the realities of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And so that's an example of the issue being talked about and really coming to light. So I want to throw it back to you all and ask, so these are just 5 examples. There are many more, and so we're interested in hearing what are the norms that you're trying to change? What are some of the norms, kind of like the unhealthy norms that you're seeing in your communities that you're actively working on changing? And while we let you think about that and share some of that, I'm going to go back to Tori and Mo and just see from the previous question what were some things that were coming up.
Thanks, Ashley. So, wow, folks are doing a lot. So we have folks who are looking at some CEPTED or crime prevention through environmental design strategies. that would improve community engagement and community connectedness. So that's how they're stretching their work to the community level. Laura is finding a way to stretch out to a level of bringing parents into the work that they're doing with kids too. So that's a really great way to get more folks involved too. Sabrina is currently at the individual and relationship levels, but Sabrina, I think it's so cool that you are doing this preventionist roundtable coalition where you have prevention folks from many different sectors in your county coming together and identifying shared risks and protective factors. That is really, really cool, and that ties in a lot to these multi-sector partnerships that we'll talk about a little bit later. And Pat also agrees. Thanks for sharing that, too. Pat is trying to reach out to Native elders on Pat's Island with the hopes of having listening sessions there, too. And Laura had commented, Ashley, on what you had shared about the normalization of gun violence being an issue and the normalization of some issues that folks may have with technology. Deetra is strengthening community level with task forces to prevent multiple forms of violence. Gosh, Mo, was there anything else that came up in the text chat for you that you wanted to bring up or circle back to?
No. I think you all do such a good job of being able to talk about what people are saying in the text chat. I'm a little bit in awe of it because this, even as being a presenter, this is a lot to look at and read, and you all really stay tuned in a good way.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mo. Well, thank you, Tori, for that reflection. And I'll just also then say some of the norms that folks are trying to change that we've been talking about in the text chat. This idea that violence is a personal issue. It's not one that other people should be involved in, right? It's not a community issue, so trying to shift that, but this is a community problem. Let's see, Stephanie brought up, this one I love so much, the norm that childcare is a good business and violence prevention strategy, looking at norms focused around the media and how folks are sexualized or not sexualized. Sex and violence are only discussed behind closed doors. So again, that idea of sex and sexual violence is really something that's super private and secret, and we can't have conversations about it. There are a norm around nurturing parents so that they can nurture their children, removing mental health stigma as a prevention strategy. So there's so many great examples, and it's really awesome to hear you all sharing them and talking about things that you're interested in trying to work on changing. So thank you for that. Mo, I want to send it back to you because I know that one thing that is really important to us and to primary prevention is making sure that we're not recreating oppressive structures in our prevention work. And so I was hoping you could walk us through some of your thinking around that.
Yes, I am happy to do that. Where's the slide? Here we go. Look, we're back at the public health model. So there are a couple of things that we all, when we were thinking about this webinar and web conference, Ashley and Tori and I had these conversations about really placing our work in context. And I think there's a couple different things to really think about. I am a white queer person who has been really lucky to start my work. I didn't go to school for this. I started my work working at a community-specific organization and doing this kind of grassroots prevention work. And then I moved to a mainstream sexual assault agency, a rape crisis center. And it was really interesting the way that I was viewed differently and the way that my work was viewed differently and the way that we talked about the work was different. And I think that when we're thinking about doing our work in this context of public health, it's really important that we place our work in this context that the work to end sexual and domestic violence has always existed, even before it became something that people could do as their job or study in school. I think that sometimes doing this work as your paid job can be seen as more legitimate, maybe because we have certain funding or because we're paid for it or because we study this in school. But I think it's always good to remember that there's lots of people who are doing this work in lots of different ways, and there's always a lot we can learn from each other. And then in thinking about public health, there is this real history of people and institutions torturing and oppressing others in this name of public health, in the name of, health for everybody. And we, might say we're not part of this or our work is really good. But I think it's really important to understand this history so that we don't continue it. And like Ashley was saying, that we don't continue any sort of harmful practices or norms. I think there's also sometimes some real relationship building that needs to happen in order to create healthy partnerships to do this work together. And I see this come up a lot of times when there are folks in these mainstream organizations who are yeah, we get all this funding and we do all this stuff and we want to work with communities who are quote unquote marginalized or underserved. And sometimes I would say we don't always do that work in the very best way, forming real true partnerships, building relationships in a great way. And it's really something that we can just continue to think about and work on and get better as we are, doing our own internal work and external work to kind of change the culture where violence exists. This leads me to infographic that I really like. This is a visual from Lydia Guy, who was working at the Washington State Coalition when she created this. This is a reimagining or revisiting of the sexual violence continuum, and we can put a link to this in the text chat. I don't know if you all have heard this or said this or thought this, but I think there's sometimes this thought that focusing on anti-oppression will dilute our work or somehow distract from our quote-unquote real work. But what we really know is that we'll never get to the root of the issue and we'll never be able to end sexual or domestic violence without working to end all forms of oppression. It's really inextricably linked. And what that means is that we can't leave it out of the work that we do. We have to include it in what we're doing. This means that just like we have to understand that larger context around public health and where we fit into that in our work, we also have to understand where we hold privilege and what our role is in building equity and what we can do and what we might have to give up or change. This image really revisions the sexual violence continuum. It places oppression in the middle. The original version, I think, was made as a GIF that had different forms of oppression kind of hopping into the front. So that it wasn't a static image. And it also has the different forms of violence kind of spiraling out from that. It has the circle on the outside with the norms that really hold this all together and reinforce everything. I would really encourage folks to check it out. The link includes not just this image, but also some more information from Lydia Guy about why she created this and what the purpose is. At NSVRC, we really like to use this in almost every training we do, just to really bring home that connection between violence and oppression and how it's so intertwined. There's also a couple things that I like to note, too, that I think are important to point out. One is not every form of oppression is listed here, which I think is helpful to know if you're working with a group of folks who are hey, I'm not represented in here. But this was designed to illustrate how all forms of oppression are linked. So I think it would be fine to add or change or at least just have that conversation about this is meant to talk about how all forms of oppression are linked. And Lydia Guy says they're often experienced in conjunction with one another too. So that's an important piece of this. The other thing I like to share is that there's a viewpoint that one person shared with me during a training that's really helped me kind of see this graphic a little bit differently. They were pointing out that the thing that they noticed about this is that the things that are taken more seriously in our society are the darker things. So things like partner rape or marital rape or murder are things that are like really taken seriously. There's like news stories written about it, all that kind of stuff. The things that are lighter tend to be those things that are often hidden or taken less seriously, which I think is definitely true when we get at some of those ones that are closer to the middle. So like sometimes misogynistic practices or sexualized media, all the forms of oppression that are in here in the middle are sometimes less noticeable or hidden or not taken as seriously. So yeah, I just wanted to like bring this up as a possible resource that could help you in your work in terms of like our own personal framing of how we do this work and how we think about this work, but also as something that maybe you could use with the folks that you're working with. If they are like, why would you want to focus on anti-racism? Maybe this could be a tool that would help you really teach them about like why does it have to do, it has to do with everything. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Mo, and there's conversation in the text chat just really appreciating this resource. So we want to actually ask you all, how do you maintain a solid foundation of anti-oppression in your work? And Mo just shared with us a really great resource, but maybe there are other resources that have been really helpful to you kind of connecting that to the work that you're doing and operationalizing some of that work. So we'd love to hear how you're maintaining a foundation of anti-oppression and what resources. And so we'll come back and see what folks are saying. But I think that, also brings us to this other, important piece of primary prevention, and that's this idea of connecting issues. And I think it was Laura that said, it's all connected. And that really is true. It's all connected. And so these are two resources that many of you might be familiar with. Maybe some of you aren't. If you haven't heard of them or checked them out, really encourage you to. So the first is Connecting the Dots. And it's these are both from CDC. It's an overview of some of the links among different types of violence. And then the second one is kind of a strategic vision for connecting the dots. So how do we actually prevent multiple forms of violence? And we know that those linkages are really important because they share a lot of the roots, the root causes. And so if we can focus on some of those roots, then we can not only prevent one form of violence, but we can prevent multiple forms of violence. Which is super important because we know that being exposed to one form of violence increases the risk of being exposed to additional. And so one thing that you'll find in there, and we're not going to go into this, but this is all available in those resources, is that you can actually see there, it's laid down some of the risk factors across different forms of violence and which ones are shared. So it can be a really helpful tool in thinking about, where you want to focus your strategies. So for example, a societal neighborhood risk factor for child maltreatment, for intimate partner violence, for sexual violence, youth violence, and suicide is a lack of economic opportunities. So if you were to maybe focus your efforts on increasing economic opportunities, you could be affecting those 5 forms of violence, which is, just smart for a lot of reasons. There's also protective factors that are focused on in these documents. And so similarly, if you were to focus your efforts on social cohesion and increasing social cohesion in a neighborhood, you could be impacting child maltreatment, teen dating violence, intimate partner violence, youth violence, bullying, suicide, and elder abuse. So that is very exciting. And Mo, I know that you all at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center have this really awesome infographic about risk and protective factors. Did you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I really like this infographic. We created it to help us and help the field see the connections between risk and protective factors, social determinants of health, and really why anti-oppression is a key part of prevention work. This was kind of our attempt to put it all together in a way that makes sense, is easy to like read and understand, and can help us think about ways that we can expand our work or think about our work a little bit differently. And there's a link on, it looks like there's a link on the slide, and we can also put that in the text chat. So you can see here there's risk and protective factors that exist at the different levels of the social ecological model. So at the community level, at the societal level, and at the individual and relationship level, they're all kind of spelled out here. The thing that I think is so interesting about this are the similarities. Once you start looking at this and you look at risk factors, protective factors, and social determinants of health, it's like, oh, there are a lot of connections. I think it can give us some really interesting ideas of who we could partner with that we might not have thought about working with before. And I think it also can really help illustrate why anti-oppression needs to be a real central focus of the work that we do. So hopefully it's interesting. We're coming out with an e-learning version of this as well. So if you like this, we have another thing for you coming up pretty soon too. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so exciting that you all have the e-learning unit coming out on it, because I know that even just reading it and seeing it from the framework of social determinants was really helpful for me too. So I love this infographic. I think it's really great for looking at risk and protective factors for sexual violence. I also want to share this one from the connection selector from Veto Violence, which is a training website from the CDC. I think it's really great for folks who are looking at connecting risk and protective factors across multiple forms of violence and looking at them throughout the different levels of the social ecological model too. So I think it's another great visualization tool for folks to use. And I pasted a link to that in the text chat. This is also a way that we can start discussing how do we engage multi-sector partners, and Ashley's going to go into some of what those sectors are in a little bit. We have a web conference where we talked about multi-sector partners recently, but you know, one of the ways that we can engage multi-sector partners, and that you all had talked about earlier too, which I think is great that you all beat me to it, is talking about it through the frame of shared risk and protective factors. And another way that looking at shared risk and protective factors enhances our work is, again, as Mo had said and earlier, is by being able to connect our risk and protective factors across forms of violence and across forms of oppression too. And I'm pasting a link to a previous PreventConnect web conference where we examined that a little bit more in depth. Ashley, did you have anything to add on that topic before we bring it to our audience? Okay, I'm seeing you shake your head. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it to you all. So we want to know from you, how do you address shared risk and protective factors and connect your prevention work to other movements? And again, keeping that anti-oppression and that connection to social justice in mind too. So while you all are engaging in that, this time I am bringing it back to Ashley to talk about what works to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence.
Thank you, Tori. Okay, so as we kind of start to wind down for today, because we don't have much time, I just wanted to share with you some more resources and some of that best available evidence that we have on what works to prevent violence. And so what you're looking at right now, two more documents, and these are our technical packages, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what a technical package is. Basically, these are groups of strategies that are based on the best available evidence that we have currently. And it really helps us to kind of hone in and focus priorities on the things that have the greatest potential to actually prevent violence. And so I don't know about you all, but when I started doing prevention work all those years ago, you know, I had a lot of ideas about what I thought could prevent violence, and those ideas are important. Like, we always need those. We need that creativity. We need to try things out. But a technical package really kind of hones in on what we know actually does have some evidence. And so just briefly, what you'll find in these, if you're not familiar with them, I believe there are 5 or 6 at this point, but there is a technical package on sexual violence specifically, and there's one on intimate partner violence. They have different components, so you're going to find strategies, or really the directions or actions, these overarching strategies that will help you achieve your goal of preventing violence. Then it also has specific approaches that you might take, and I'm going to show you an example of that. Not only does it have strategies and approaches, but it's also going to, the technical packages share example programs, policies, or practices, and then they showcase some of the evidence behind them so we can see, what specifically works. And here I go. Okay, so what you're looking at on your screen is the sexual violence technical package, the strategies and approaches, and so you'll see that there are 5 strategies, and then within each one of those strategies there are several approaches that have been identified. And so just for example, the first one, we talked about it, is promoting social norms to protect against violence. And so one of the approaches that might fit into that would be bystander approaches, which many of you are engaged in, or mobilizing men and boys as allies. And I saw that some of you are doing Coaching Boys into Men. I saw Boys to Kings was another program that I'm guessing would probably fit into this strategy and approach. Another one that we talked a lot about that Mo touched on was, as we hop down to the P, creating protective environments. And so this is really looking at addressing community-level risks through environmental approaches, so actually changing the conditions in an environment. But there's other examples there as well. I want to also just show you the intimate partner violence prevention strategies and approaches. And so it's kind of hard to see on your screen, but I think Tori put a link to where you can actually see the whole technical package. But they're very similar to the sexual violence one, surprise, surprise. And so the first one is teach safe and healthy relationship skills, very similar to what we saw in the sexual violence technical package. And so what I am going to do, because those are available for you, we also did web conferences on them. But one thing that I want to show you really quickly, give me 1 second, is that a really big piece of these strategies and approaches is that they really do require multi-sector involvement. And so it shouldn't just be a sexual violence or intimate partner violence prevention practitioner that's working on these strategies and approaches, but we need people from all sorts of sectors, from public health all the way to housing, to media, to the business sector, to be involved in us really being successful with implementing these strategies and approaches. So I wanted to share that with you all. Tori, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted you to talk briefly about evaluation, because that is such an important component and something that the technical packages definitely touch on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ashley. I am working on getting links to our previous PreventConnect web conferences on the technical packages in the text chat. And just so folks know, the text chat will be available after this web conference too. So if you miss a resource, we will come back to it and you will have that at your disposal later. So evaluation is super important to our work, and it occurs at every stage of our work too, including with community assessment. And so before I have Mo come back and give a brief shout out to the NSBRC evaluation toolkit, I did want to give you all some resources for community assessment. because I do think it's also something that is so important when we're talking about having our work be community-specific, involving communities, and making sure that we're coming at our work from an anti-oppressive lens, too. And so I just pasted a link to the close-to-home assess phase in the text chat, and I'm adding some more, too. But I do think that the close-to-home assess phase has a really great excerpt on their website about why it's important to do community assessment. And basically what they say is that it honors, explores, and documents local knowledge and amplifies voices that are traditionally marginalized by services and systems that take on a role as the primary knowledge providers or the expertise holders and decision makers. So community assessment is one way to center your communities in the work that you do. And it can be really impactful when building partnerships too. So in addition to the fact that, we just want to make sure that if we're putting all this effort into our prevention programs, they meet the needs and help our communities. It's also a way to bring power back to communities too, or to uplift that power that already exists in communities that sometimes in public health or in professional roles can be talked over a little bit. So Mo, would you mind coming back in and giving us a really brief shout out of the NSVRC evaluation toolkit?
Yeah, shout out. That's it. No, I'm just kidding. The evaluation toolkit is really nice. It's a living, breathing document, so we're always putting new things into it. And basically, you can kind of go as shallow or as deep as you want. There's lots of learning tools. You can kind of just jump in and see what's out there and explore to your heart's content. That's what I'll say.
Thanks, Mel. Really appreciate that quick shout out. And then I know we had questions earlier about what is evidence-based, and so I do want to leave you all with this resource on CDC's Understanding Evidence. This, again, ties into what Mo had mentioned earlier about who is the best available research evidence for, who is it tested for, and very recently there was some research done about that shows that green dot, something that has been the best available research evidence for so long, we're now finding is not effective for LGBTQ+ youth. So this is a great example of why it's important to also be uplifting experiential and contextual evidence and the importance of community assessment and making sure that our programs are fitting with communities and belonging with communities too. So I do think we wanted to talk a little bit about communicating about prevention and those two communication guides. We are running out of time, so I am just going to paste the links to those in the text chat for you all to enjoy later, and just know that these are really great resources for communicating internally and externally about the prevention work that we're doing.
Thanks, Tori. Yeah, I really encourage you all to download the slides because we do have all of the links that Tori's been posting in the text chat on the slides. And the next couple of things are really just some additional resources that you can access at your leisure, at your own pace if you want to. And so we mentioned the PreventConnect e-learning site, NSVRC, and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape also have some great resources on campus work, some e-learning units on campus. So if you're working on a college campus, that would be really useful for you. We'll post, where you can find all of the CDC technical packages, not just the two that we highlighted. Veto violence, also the CDC site has a lot of different e-learning activities and units and resources. And so that's available to you. And then our friends at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence also have preventipv.org. And there's all sorts of prevention tools and resources to prevent intimate partner violence. And so those are a bunch of other resources outside of this web conference for you all to check out. But at this point, I just want to thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for being so what's the word I'm looking for? Talkative in the text chat, for engaging with us, for sharing, for connecting with one another. That's so important. Mo, thank you. Thank you for doing this with us. Yeah.
It's so fun, and this is a lot of stuff. So I kind of want to revisit half of it myself. Yeah.
Yeah. It is a lot of stuff. We're going to send out an evaluation survey in a few minutes, and we'd love for you to respond to that. And if there are some specific areas of things that we touched on that you'd love to go deeper, let us know in that survey, because this was kind of just like a broad overview of key concepts and tools, but we'd love to dig deeper on some of these topics. So thank you, Mo. Thank you, Tori. Thank you, all of you in our audience, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and I hope to see you on a future PreventConnect web conference. This is going to end our web conference for today. Take care, everyone.